7:15 in the evening, February 7th, 2008. The temperature outside hovered around 50 degrees, but inside the packing building of the Imperial Sugar Refinery in Port Wentworth, Georgia, the air carried a different kind of warmth. Not from furnaces, not from boilers, from friction, from conveyor belts moving tons of granulated sugar beneath 3 towering concrete silos, from bucket elevators lifting sweet crystals 100 feet into humid Georgia air, from hammer mills grinding granulated sugar into powder so fine it hung suspended in the atmosphere like morning fog over the Savannah River. Workers moved through the 4-story packing building, surrounded by this haze, their boots leaving prints in sugar that had accumulated several inches deep on the floor. In some places knee-deep, sugar coated the overhead pipes, sugar blanketed the light fixtures. Sugar layered itself onto every horizontal surface until the entire building shimmered white, as if dusted by a permanent frost. This was ordinary. This was every night. This was how sugar had been packed in Port Wentworth since Woodrow Wilson sat in the White House. Then a bearing overheated inside an enclosed conveyor beneath silo number 1. The temperature climbed past 300 degrees, past 400. The sugar dust inside that steel enclosure reached its minimum explosible concentration, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the entire center of the refinery transformed from workplace to inferno. 14 workers would never leave that building alive. Some died that night, buried beneath collapsed brick walls or trapped by buckled concrete floors. Others burned for months in hospital beds before their bodies surrendered. The fires inside the sugar silos continued burning for 7 days after the initial blast, consuming 3 million pounds of crystallized sweetness, while investigators tried to understand how something as innocent as sugar could detonate with the force of dynamite. The Chemical Safety Board called it entirely preventable. Was it corporate negligence or corporate ignorance? Was it the predictable outcome of 90 years of accumulated risk, or a betrayal of 400 families who had built their lives around the promise of steady work at the Dixie Crystals refinery? The story of Imperial Sugar begins not in Georgia, but in Texas, on land that would eventually bear the name of the very product that made fortunes and destroyed lives. In 1843, a decade before Texas became a state, Samuel May Williams built a raw sugar mill on Oakland Plantation in a swampy corner of southeast Texas. The operation was modest by later standards. Mule-powered mills crushed sugarcane stalks. Cast-iron kettles boiled the extracted juice into crude syrup. Williams and his neighbors harvested enough cane to justify processing it into granulated sugar, and so the commercial enterprise that would eventually become Imperial Sugar Company drew its first breath in the antebellum South. The plantation changed hands multiple times over the following decades. Benjamin Terry and William Kyle purchased it around 1852, renaming it Sugarland Plantation. After the Civil War, a man named E.H. Cunningham acquired the property and built what passed for a modern sugar refinery in 1879. Cunningham expanded aggressively. He constructed additional facilities, purchased neighboring land, and by the turn of the 20th century, had assembled an industrial complex processing raw sugar at a scale that dwarfed the original Williams operation. But Cunningham overextended himself. Bad loans accumulated. 2 major floods damaged his crops. The Great Storm of 1900 that devastated Galveston sent ripples of destruction up the Texas coast. By 1902, Cunningham was elderly, in poor health, and watching his sugar empire crumble into receivership. The workers who labored in his fields and refineries operated under conditions that would haunt Texas history for generations. Cunningham had relied on convict leasing, the practice of renting prison inmates from the state to perform grueling agricultural labor. These were predominantly black men, working under conditions so brutal that survivors called the plantation the hellhole of the Brazos. Historical estimates suggest thousands died under this system before it finally ended. Into this wreckage stepped 2 men who would transform a failing plantation into the oldest continuously operating business in Texas. Isaac H. Kempner, a prominent Galveston businessman, partnered with William T. Eldridge in 1907 to purchase Cunningham's entire operation. They reorganized it under a new name that Kempner associated with prestige and permanence, Imperial Sugar Company. Eldridge moved to Sugarland to personally manage the transition. The neighboring bar and brothel were immediately shuttered. The convict labor system was dismantled. In its place, Kempner and Eldridge pursued a different model entirely. They would build a company town designed to attract what they called family-type workers to an isolated refinery miles from anywhere. Houses were constructed, streets were paved, churches, schools, and medical facilities rose from the Texas mud. By 1911, The Imperial Sugar Company had transformed Sugarland from a notorious labor camp into something resembling a self-contained community, all of it owned and controlled by the company that employed its residents. The refinery itself underwent similar transformation. Eldridge imported raw sugar from Cuba rather than relying on unreliable Texas cane crops, a decision that freed the operation from the vagaries of local agriculture. By 1907, the plant was producing 500,000 pounds of refined sugar daily, making it the only sugar refinery operating in the American Southwest. The Kempner family would maintain their ownership stake for decades, building one of the most successful regional sugar companies in the nation. But this is not the story of Sugarland, Texas. This is the story of what happened when Imperial Sugar reached beyond its original boundaries, when a company built on Texas soil acquired a facility in Georgia that had been refining sugar since the First World War, and how that acquisition planted the seeds for a catastrophe that would take nearly a century to bloom. The Savannah River curves through the Georgia lowcountry like a silver ribbon separating the state from South Carolina. Ships have navigated its waters since colonial times, carrying cotton and timber and rice to ports around the world. In 1916, a sugar refiner named Benjamin Oxnard looked at those waters and saw something else entirely. He saw a highway for raw sugar shipments from Cuba and the Caribbean. He saw cheap land adjacent to deep water. He saw an opportunity to build a refinery that could supply the entire American Southeast with granulated sugar. Oxnard came from a family of sugar refiners. With his father and 3 brothers, he had operated the Fulton Sugar Refinery in Brooklyn. Later, he and partner Richard Sprague ran a plantation and refinery called Adeline in St. Mary's Parish, Louisiana. But the Louisiana operation had encountered a devastating series of setbacks. Fire severely damaged the complex. After rebuilding, consecutive seasons of floods, droughts, and frosts destroyed their sugarcane supply. New laws allowing free entry of foreign-produced sugar into the United States made domestic cane production increasingly uncompetitive. Oxnard needed to relocate, and he needed a site with access to imported raw sugar. He found it in Port Wentworth, a tiny community on a 30-acre tract fronting the Savannah River. The logistics were ideal. Ships carrying raw sugar from Caribbean plantations could dock directly at the refinery. Rail lines could distribute the finished product throughout the Southeast. Oxnard and Sprague made a decision that would define Port Wentworth's identity for the next century. They would move their entire sugar refining operation, including more than 400 employees and their families, from Louisiana to Georgia. Construction began in 1916. Workers erected the main refinery building on the riverbank, a 4-story structure that would house the processes transforming raw brown sugar into the pure white crystals that American consumers expected in their kitchens. They built warehouses for raw sugar storage. They constructed packaging facilities. They dug a tunnel beneath what would become 3 enormous concrete storage silos, installing conveyor systems to move processed sugar throughout the complex. The Savannah Sugar Refining Corporation chose a brand name that would become synonymous with Southern sugar for generations: Dixie Crystals. On July 7, 1917, the first batch of refined sugar emerged from the Port Wentworth refinery. America had entered the First World War 3 months earlier, and the government had taken control of sugar production to ensure adequate supplies for both civilian and military needs. The timing could not have been better. Demand surged, prices rose. The Dixie Crystals refinery ran at capacity, and the 400 families who had relocated from Louisiana found themselves anchored to a thriving industrial operation in a region where steady employment was hardly guaranteed. When the war ended, sugar prices collapsed in a speculative frenzy that insiders called the Dance of the Millions, named for the fortunes that evaporated when raw sugar prices crashed from their artificial wartime heights. But the Savannah refinery survived where others failed. The Oxnard and Sprague families maintained their control, adapting to market conditions and finding ways to keep their operation profitable, even as the Great Depression drove raw sugar prices to barely a penny per pound. By 1936, the company had recovered sufficiently to offer employees a bonus equivalent to 10% of their yearly salaries. 2 years later, they introduced an innovation that seemed minor at the time, but would become standard throughout the industry: bagging sugar in paper rather than cloth. The refinery that had opened with 19 million pounds of raw sugar in storage grew steadily larger. Additional processing capacity was added. The storage silos were constructed in 1935, 3 reinforced concrete towers rising over 100 feet above the packing buildings, each capable of holding about 3 million pounds of granulated sugar. The packaging facilities expanded to accommodate mechanized bagging equipment, palletizing machinery, and the conveyor systems needed to move finished product from the silos to the warehouses to the loading docks. By mid-century, the Dixie Crystals Refinery had become the first large industry in Savannah's Upper Harbor and one of the most important employers in Chatham County. Sugar refining is a deceptively simple process with dangerous complications hidden at every stage. Raw sugar arrives at the refinery as brown crystals covered in a thin film of molasses, the residue of initial processing at sugar mills near the cane fields. This raw sugar can be stored for months, but the molasses coating provides an incubator for microbial growth, so refiners must work quickly once processing begins. The first step is affination, washing the raw sugar with warm, nearly saturated syrup to loosen and dissolve the molasses film. The mixture enters centrifuges that spin at tremendous speed, flinging the dark molasses away from the sugar crystals and leaving behind a purer product ready for the next stage. These crystals are then dissolved in hot water and filtered through various clarification systems. Some refineries use bone char, manufactured from degreased cattle bones, as an adsorbent to remove remaining impurities and color. Others employ granular activated carbon or chemical treatments. The goal is a colorless syrup of pure sucrose. This clarified syrup enters evaporators that concentrate the liquid by removing water under carefully controlled temperatures. The thickened syrup then moves to vacuum pans where crystallization occurs. Technicians seed the supersaturated solution with tiny sugar crystals, and over time, larger crystals form around these seeds. The resulting mixture of crystals and remaining syrup, called masacuite, goes back through centrifuges to separate the finished sugar from the mother liquor. The sugar that emerges from this process is naturally white. It requires drying to remove residual moisture, cooling to prevent caking, and conditioning in storage silos before packaging. At Port Wentworth, this final stage involved moving dried sugar through an elaborate system of conveyors, bucket elevators, and screw augers that transported millions of pounds of granulated crystals from the refinery to the silos, to the packaging building, to the loading docks. Every step of this process generates dust. Fine sugar particles become airborne whenever the product is moved, ground, sifted, or poured. Hammer mills that grind granulated sugar into powdered sugar produce particularly dense concentrations of airborne particles. Conveyor transfer points where sugar drops from one belt to another create localized dust clouds. Bucket elevators scoop sugar from pits and carry it vertically in enclosed housings. And every time a bucket discharges its contents, dust disperses into the surrounding air. The sugar industry had understood the explosive potential of this dust since at least 1925, when a comprehensive study documented the combustion characteristics of sugar particles. Like flour, grain, coal, wood, and dozens of other organic materials, sugar dust becomes explosively flammable when suspended in air at the right concentration. The minimum explosible concentration for sugar dust hovers around 40 grams per cubic meter. Below that threshold, there is not enough fuel to sustain combustion. Above a certain upper limit, there is not enough oxygen. But within the explosive range, a single ignition source can trigger a deflagration that propagates through the dust cloud at tremendous speed. The physics are straightforward. A suspended dust particle has an enormous surface area to volume ratio compared to a solid lump of the same material. When ignited, each particle burns almost instantaneously, releasing heat that ignites neighboring particles. In an enclosed space, the expanding gases from this combustion create pressure waves. If the pressure rises faster than it can vent through openings in the structure, the result is an explosion capable of heaving concrete floors, collapsing brick walls, and throwing human bodies like rag dolls. Secondary explosions are often more devastating than the initial blast. The shock wave from a primary explosion dislodges accumulated dust from overhead surfaces, light fixtures, piping, and equipment. This dust becomes airborne, mixes with oxygen, and encounters the flames still burning from the first ignition. The resulting secondary deflagration can be orders of magnitude more powerful than the event that triggered it. At Port Wentworth, sugar dust had been accumulating on horizontal surfaces for decades. Workers accepted it as an inevitable consequence of the work. Management accepted it as a cost of doing business. Savannah Foods and Industries grew steadily through the second half of the 20th century, expanding beyond its Georgia roots to become a major national sugar producer. In 1984, the company acquired Michigan Sugar, a beet sugar producer operating processing plants across the upper Midwest. A year later, it added Great Lakes Sugar Company. In 1986, Savannah Foods purchased Colonial Sugar Refinery in Gramercy, Louisiana, adding another cane sugar processing facility to its portfolio. By the mid-1990s, the company that had started with 400 employees on the banks of the Savannah River had become the second-largest sugar refiner in the United States, marketing its products under the Dixie Crystals brand throughout the Southeast and the Pioneer brand in the Great Lakes region. This growth attracted attention from larger competitors seeking to consolidate the fragmented American sugar industry. In 1988, Imperial Sugar Company of Sugar Land, Texas, merged with Holly Sugar Company, a beet sugar producer founded in Colorado in 1905. The combined company, Imperial Holly Corporation, operated both cane and beet sugar facilities across multiple states. In 1996, Imperial Holly acquired Spreckels Sugar Company of California. The following year, Imperial Holly set its sights on Savannah Foods and Industries. The acquisition would transform Imperial from a regional Texas sugar company into the largest processor and refiner of sugar in the United States, controlling roughly 33% of the national market. In December 1997, Imperial Holly completed a $567 million acquisition of Savannah Foods, paying a premium that reflected both the strategic value of the Dixie Crystals brand and the significance of the Port Wentworth refinery. The math behind this transaction would prove fateful. Imperial had leveraged itself heavily to fund the acquisition spree of the late 1990s. When energy costs spiked and refined sugar sales declined in the new millennium, the debt burden became unsustainable. On January 16, 2001, Imperial Sugar and all its subsidiaries filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in Delaware Federal Court. Bankruptcy reorganization forced Imperial to shed assets and refocus on core operations. Michigan Sugar Company was sold to a grower cooperative in 2002. The Rocky Mountain beet facilities went to American Crystal Sugar Company. Most significantly for the company's identity, Imperial closed its original Sugarland refinery in 2003, ending more than a century of sugar production at the site that had given the company its name. Corporate headquarters remained in Sugarland, but the actual sugar refining now happened elsewhere. The Port Wentworth facility became increasingly critical to Imperial's survival. In the fiscal year ending September 2007, the Georgia refinery processed over 14 million hundredweight of sugar, equivalent to nearly 660,000 metric tons, representing 9% of the entire nation's sugar requirements. 90% of the raw sugar feeding this production arrived by ship from overseas, continuing the model that Benjamin Oxnard had established when he chose the Savannah River location in 1916. But the facility was old. Workers described it as antiquated, with much of the machinery dating back 28 years or more. The original construction methods from 1916 and 1917 remained embedded in the building's bones. The packing building's ceiling featured wooden tongue-and-groove construction, creosote-treated timber, known locally as fat lighter because of the fire risk it posed, supported structural elements throughout the complex. The storage silos dated from 1935. The conveyor systems, bucket elevators, and packaging equipment had been upgraded piecemeal over the decades, but the fundamental infrastructure remained a product of early 20th century engineering. Imperial's financial condition in the years before the explosion limited the company's ability to invest in comprehensive modernization. Sales had fallen 8% in fiscal 2007. Profits and stock price had dropped by half. The company's own annual reports acknowledged that any damage to the Port Wentworth facility would have a material effect on business operations, financial condition, and cash flows. Imperial was betting its corporate future on an aging refinery that generated fine combustible dust with every ton of sugar it processed. The sugar industry did not lack for warning signs about dust explosion hazards. In the 1960s, 2 separate sugar dust explosions killed a total of 10 workers at refineries around the country. Internal correspondence from Port Wentworth management dating to 1967 showed serious concern about the possibility of a sugar dust explosion that could travel from one area to another, wrecking large sections of a plant. These were not theoretical concerns expressed in academic journals. These were operational managers, recognizing that their facilities contained the ingredients for catastrophe. But the decades passed without a major incident at Port Wentworth, and this apparent safety record bred a dangerous complacency. Smaller fires occurred regularly. Overheated bearings or electrical devices ignited localized blazes that workers extinguished before they spread. Sugar dust accumulated on surfaces, workers swept it away or simply worked around it, and the rhythm of production continued uninterrupted. The near misses failed to penetrate management consciousness as urgent warnings. Instead, they normalized the hazardous conditions that made larger accidents inevitable. In 1998, an explosion occurred at Imperial's original Sugarland refinery in Texas, a precursor event that should have prompted system-wide safety reviews. In November 2007, just 3 months before the Port Wentworth disaster, an explosion struck the Domino sugar plant in Baltimore. The sugar industry was experiencing exactly the pattern of escalating incidents that typically precedes major industrial catastrophe. The Chemical Safety Board, an independent federal agency charged with investigating industrial chemical accidents, had been tracking these events with growing alarm. In 2004, the CSB conducted a comprehensive study of dust explosion hazards prompted by 3 fatal accidents the previous year. The West Pharmaceutical Services explosion in North Carolina killed 6 workers. The CTA Acoustics explosion in Kentucky killed 7. The Hayes-Lemmerz explosion in Indiana killed 1. Between 1980 and 2005, the CSB identified 281 explosions involving combustible dust across American industry, resulting in 119 deaths and 718 injuries. The CSB recommended that the Occupational Safety and Health Administration issue a comprehensive combustible dust standard for general industry. OSHA declined to pursue formal rulemaking, but instead issued a Combustible Dust National Emphasis Program in October 2007, directing federal inspectors to increase inspections at facilities that might present dust explosion hazards. Imperial Sugar Management received and reviewed this OSHA guidance shortly after its release. Internal communications confirmed that supervisory personnel distributed the document within the company, but prompt action to address the significant dust accumulations at Port Wentworth did not follow. The guidance was acknowledged, perhaps discussed, then filed away while sugar continued piling up on floors and coating overhead surfaces throughout the packing building. Photographs from the years preceding the explosion show conditions that any trained safety professional would recognize as catastrophic waiting to happen. Sugar dust visible on conduits and piping. Spilled sugar covering equipment. Drifts of granulated product accumulated around packaging machinery. Quality audits and worker injury reports from the year preceding the explosion documented spilled sugar at knee depth or higher in portions of the facility. Workers had grown so accustomed to these conditions that they no longer registered as exceptional. Less than 2 weeks before the February explosion, a small blast occurred in a dry dust collector on the roof of the packing building. The explosion damaged the collector, but was safely vented through deflagration vent panels designed specifically for this purpose. The dust collector had not yet been returned to service at the time of the main incident. Here was an unmistakable signal that the facility's dust hazards had reached explosive concentrations, that the safety systems designed to prevent catastrophe were actively being triggered. The warning was ignored. The decision that would prove immediately fatal came in early 2007, months before the explosion. Imperial Sugar Management identified a quality control concern with the granulated sugar conveyor system running beneath the storage silos. The open steel belt conveyor in the silo tunnel allowed potential contamination from debris that might fall onto the sugar. Customers expected pure product, and any foreign matter mixed into the sugar represented a quality defect that could damage the Dixie Crystals brand. The solution seemed straightforward. Engineers designed a stainless steel enclosure that would cover the conveyor belt with top and side panels, protecting the sugar from contamination during its transit from the silos to the packaging building. The enclosure was installed, the contamination risk was addressed, and the conveyor continued operating as before. But no one evaluated the hazards associated with generating and accumulating combustible dust inside the newly enclosed space. No one installed a dust removal system to ensure that sugar dust did not reach explosive concentrations within the enclosure. No one equipped the enclosure with deflagration vents to safely direct the pressure wave if combustible dust inside ignited. For more than 80 years, the facility had operated the open conveyor in the silo tunnel without a major incident. The dust generated during normal operations had dispersed into the larger tunnel volume, mixing with air and settling onto floors and walls at concentrations below the explosive threshold. The new enclosure created a confined space 1/10 the size of the original tunnel volume. Dust that once dispersed harmlessly now accumulated in a steel box equipped with an overheating bearing as a potential ignition source. This was a textbook example of a failed management of change process. Any modification to an industrial facility can introduce new hazards or alter existing risk profiles. Formal change management procedures require systematic evaluation of safety implications before implementing modifications. At Port Wentworth, the conveyor enclosure was installed to address one concern while creating a far more dangerous condition. Less than a year after completion, the consequences materialized. February 7, 2008, fell on a Thursday. The weather was mild for winter in coastal Georgia. Temperatures comfortable enough that workers arrived at the refinery without heavy coats. The evening shift began as countless shifts before it, with workers taking their positions at packaging machines, monitoring conveyor systems, and maintaining the continuous flow of sugar from silos to bags to pallets to warehouses. At approximately 7:15 in the evening, routine operations in the silo tunnel encountered a common problem. Sugar clumps had clogged the discharge chutes at the base of silo number 1. Workers used steel rods inserted through access ports to break up these blockages, a standard procedure called rodding. While this was occurring, sugar continued flowing from silo number 2 onto the moving belt upstream of silo number 1. The system was designed to handle this. Sugar simply accumulated on the belt until the blockage cleared and normal flow resumed. Inside the enclosed conveyor beneath the silos, conditions had reached a critical threshold. Sugar dust generated by the moving belt and the rodding operations had accumulated above the minimum explosible concentration. The steel enclosure trapped this dust in a volume small enough to maintain explosive conditions. Investigators would later conclude that an overheated bearing on the conveyor belt most likely provided the ignition source. The bearing had been running continuously, friction generating heat, temperature climbing toward the 300 to 400 degrees Celsius range at which sugar dust ignites. The first explosion initiated inside the enclosed conveyor. The pressure wave from this primary deflagration crumpled the steel panels of the enclosure, blowing them out into the packing building. The shock wave propagated through the tunnel, into the rooms at the base of the silos, into the East Bucket elevator pit, where it ignited additional dust accumulations. Secondary explosions followed in rapid succession. The initial blast had shaken decades of accumulated sugar dust from overhead surfaces throughout the packing building. Pipes, beams, light fixtures, and equipment that had been coated with fine particles released their burden into the air. This dust, suddenly airborne at explosive concentrations, encountered the flames still burning from the primary explosion. The resulting deflagrations moved through the entire north and south packing and palletizer buildings like fireballs, advancing through a gasoline-soaked structure. 3-inch thick concrete floor slabs heaved and buckled from the explosive force, opening large crevasses. Piles of granulated and powdered sugar that had accumulated around equipment rained down and intensified the fires burning below. Brick walls collapsed into stairwells and exit routes, blocking escape paths for workers trying to flee the inferno. The wooden ceiling construction ignited. The creosote-treated timber structural elements burned with the ferocity their nickname had promised. The fire sprinkler system failed almost immediately when exploding pressure waves ruptured the pipes. Emergency lighting systems lost power when the blast disabled the facility's electrical infrastructure. Workers found themselves plunged into darkness in a building transformed into a maze of collapsed walls, buckled floors, burning sugar, and toxic smoke. 112 employees were on site when the explosion occurred. The blast centered on the packaging and storage facilities where workers were actively operating machinery, monitoring conveyor systems, and moving product. Some died instantly, buried beneath falling masonry or consumed by the initial fireballs. Others suffered devastating burns as the flames swept through spaces faster than human reflexes could respond. 2 workers who had escaped the initial blast re-entered the burning building, attempting to rescue their co-workers. They did not emerge alive. Their bodies would be recovered from the wreckage in the days following, testament to a courage that circumstances rendered futile. Witnesses from across the Savannah River in South Carolina reported seeing flames shoot several stories into the night sky. The explosion had transformed the center of the refinery into an inferno visible for miles. Within minutes, emergency calls flooded dispatch centers across multiple counties. Port Wentworth Fire Chief Gregory Long was enjoying dinner with his wife and a neighboring fire chief when his pager sounded with notification of an explosion at the sugar refinery. The Port Wentworth Fire Department, a combination agency with 5 paid firefighters, augmented by 20 volunteers, would find itself commanding the largest emergency response in the region's history. As Long drove toward the plant, he attempted to raise his first responding units by radio. The news was already catastrophic. Access to the refinery came through a 2-lane road bordered by large oak trees draped with Spanish moss, a picturesque approach that masked the destruction ahead. The first arriving engines found the packaging building fully involved in flames, structural damage extensive, workers either fleeing the complex or trapped inside the collapsing structures. The blast had destroyed the facility's power systems, plunging the perimeter into darkness. No lights guided rescuers toward victims. No functioning sprinkler system suppressed the spreading flames. Intelligence quickly confirmed that several large water mains had ruptured, rendering hydrant pressure inadequate for the aerial operations the fire demanded. 22 different fire departments would ultimately respond, deploying 232 firefighters to the scene. Savannah Fire arrived quickly from a station on West Bay Street, offering mutual aid to the overwhelmed Port Wentworth crew. Ambulances converged from across 12 counties. River tugboats equipped with pumps drafted water from the Savannah to supply aerial units positioned along the riverbank. The United States Coast Guard closed river traffic in the area, while a helicopter searched the water for anyone who might have been thrown into the current by the blast force. First responders confronted conditions unlike anything they had trained for or imagined. The physical layout of the refinery was labyrinthine, a complex of interconnected buildings, conveyor towers, and storage structures that employees spent years learning to navigate. Outside rescue personnel had no such familiarity. Off-duty Imperial sugar workers were brought in to guide search teams through the wreckage. Red Cross worker Joyce Baker, among the first to arrive at the scene, later described the experience as walking into hell. Some of the men she treated had no skin at all. Others had skin just dripping off them. The Georgia Emergency Management Agency alerted local hospitals to prepare for up to 100 casualties. Doctors at Memorial Health Hospital in Savannah described patients arriving with burn injuries ranging from minor to 95% body surface involvement. The Joseph M. Still Burn Center in Augusta, one of the premier burn treatment facilities in the southeastern United States, began receiving the most critically injured patients. Helicopters flew survivors the roughly 100 miles from Port Wentworth to Augusta, racing against the clock that ticks relentlessly for severe burn victims. 8 patients would ultimately require treatment at the specialized burn center. 5 of them would eventually die there, succumbing to injuries sustained in the few seconds it took the explosion to transform the packing building from workplace to crematorium. The initial death toll reported that night was 4. Firefighters recovered 4 bodies from the rubble during the first search operations. 6 additional workers remained missing, their locations unknown, their fates uncertain. The structural damage was so extensive, the fire so persistent, that rescue teams could not safely enter large sections of the complex to search for victims. The next morning brought no relief. Portions of the building continued smoldering. The concrete storage silos, each still containing hundreds of thousands of pounds of sugar, had become towering pyres that defied conventional firefighting tactics. Heavy equipment was brought in to shore up partially collapsed structures before rescuers could safely search the debris. The families of missing workers gathered at a Catholic church across the street from the refinery, waiting for news that everyone feared, but no one wanted to deliver. Over the following days, search teams working methodically through the wreckage located the remaining victims. The Region 5 Georgia Search and Rescue Team, deploying for the first time to a local emergency, conducted confined space searches that located every missing employee and brought the final 8 bodies home to their families. 7 days after the initial explosion, the silo fires were finally declared extinguished on February 15th. The final death count stood at 14. The names deserve recording: Eric Barnes, John Calvin Butler Jr., Truett Byers, Alfonso Fields Sr., Michael Kelly Fields, Malcolm Frazier, McKinley Von Habersham Sr., Shalathia Sean Harvey, Earl Johnson, Patricia Ann Pat Lowe Proctor, Earl Quarterman, Byron Singleton, Tony Thomas, Michael Big Mike Williams. Their ages ranged from 18 to 50. Some were longtime employees who had spent their entire careers at the Dixie Crystals refinery. Others were newer workers, just establishing themselves in jobs that promised steady wages and community standing. 36 additional workers survived their injuries, though some faced permanent life-altering conditions. 14 of the survivors spent months receiving treatment at the Augusta Burn Center. The road back from severe burns is measured in years of surgeries, skin grafts, physical therapy, and psychological recovery. Some of these survivors would carry visible reminders of February 7th for the rest of their lives. The investigators arrived within hours. OSHA personnel reached the scene before midnight on the night of the explosion. The Chemical Safety Board dispatched a team that arrived the following morning. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives conducted a brief investigation to determine whether deliberate criminal activity had caused the blast. Georgia state firefighters and police contributed to the initial response. The ATF and state investigators concluded relatively quickly that no criminal activity was involved. The explosion was industrial in nature, caused by conditions within the plant, rather than any external hostile act. The physical evidence told a story that would take months to fully reconstruct. Investigators examined blast patterns and damage in the silo tunnel, at the east and west tunnel openings, in the rooms at the base of the silos. They photographed the crumpled steel panels that had been blown from the conveyor enclosure. They documented the heaved concrete floors, the collapsed brick walls, the burned structural timbers. They traced the path of the fireballs through the building, mapping the progression of secondary explosions that had transformed localized ignition into facility-wide catastrophe. The enclosed conveyor belt installed in 2007 emerged as the proximate cause of the initial explosion. Less than a year after that enclosure was completed, the silos and packing buildings had been destroyed. The correlation was not coincidental, but the CSB investigation went deeper than proximate causes. Internal correspondence dating from 1967 documented management awareness of dust explosion hazards. Photographs from the 1970s through 2007 showed persistent dust accumulation problems. Quality audits and worker injury reports from the year preceding the explosion had documented knee-deep spilled sugar. The OSHA Combustible Dust National Emphasis Program had been distributed to management just months before the blast. A dust collector explosion had occurred less than 2 weeks before the main event. At every level, the evidence pointed to systemic failure rather than isolated error. Imperial Sugar Management had not taken effective actions over many years to control dust explosion hazards. Smaller fires and explosions had continued occurring at their plants and other sugar facilities around the country. The company had allowed itself to grow comfortable with conditions that anyone familiar with dust explosion science would recognize as unacceptable. In the first quarter of 2008, Imperial Sugar posted a $15.5 million loss, attributing the result primarily to the Port Wentworth explosion. The company's stock price, already depressed from years of declining performance, fell further as investors assessed the implications of losing the firm's most productive refinery. Imperial's board of directors announced their intention to rebuild. The 371 workers displaced by the explosion continued receiving payment from the company. 275 were eventually rehired to assist with cleanup and demolition of structures that could not be salvaged. Work began on April 18, 2008, after the board confirmed the commitment to restore operations. The sugar silos that had burned for 7 days presented a demolition challenge. A wrecking ball was used on June 24 to bring down the damaged concrete structures. During demolition, workers recovered approximately 2,800,000 pounds of fire-hardened sugar from one silo and another 500,000 pounds from the second. The company hoped to recycle this material for ethanol production. OSHA's investigation produced findings that would translate into some of the largest workplace safety penalties in the agency's history. Inspectors documented 221 safety violations at the Port Wentworth facility. 108 of these were classified as willful violations, specifically related to combustible dust hazards. 10 additional willful violations addressed other safety failures. 100 serious violations and 4 other than serious citations rounded out the charges. The penalty initially proposed exceeded $8 million. Imperial Sugar also faced citations and fines at its Gramercy, Louisiana refinery, which the company had shut down 6 weeks after the Port Wentworth disaster, over fears that similar conditions might trigger an explosion there. OSHA fined Imperial $36,000 for safety violations at the Louisiana plant. In July 2010, Imperial Sugar agreed to settle the OSHA charges for $6 million. With more than $4 million allocated to violations at Port Wentworth. The company also accepted a 3-year program of intensive OSHA oversight at its Georgia refinery. In the settlement agreement, Imperial admitted no wrongdoing but ceased contesting the citations. OSHA requested that the Office of United States Attorney Edward Tarver consider criminal charges against Imperial or its executives. The criminal investigation dragged on for years before Tarver announced in February 2013 that he would not pursue prosecution. He cited insufficient evidence and the lack of a felony provision under the prevailing statute. The workers who had died and their families would not see anyone held criminally accountable for the conditions that had killed 14 people. The Chemical Safety Board released its final investigation report in September 2009, 19 months after the explosion. The document ran over 100 pages and concluded that the disaster had been entirely preventable. Sugar and cornstarch conveying equipment was not designed or maintained to minimize the release of sugar and sugar dust into the work area. Inadequate housekeeping practices resulted in significant accumulations of combustible granulated and powdered sugar and combustible sugar dust on the floors and elevated surfaces throughout the packing buildings. Airborne combustible sugar dust accumulated above the minimum explosible concentration inside the newly enclosed steel belt assembly under silos 1 and 2. An overheated bearing in the steel belt conveyor most likely ignited a primary dust explosion. The primary dust explosion inside the enclosed steel conveyor belt triggered massive secondary dust explosions and fires throughout the packing buildings. Beyond these technical findings, the CSB documented broader organizational failures. The company had not conducted evacuation drills for its employees. The explosions and fires disabled most of the emergency lighting, making it difficult for workers to escape from the labyrinth of explosion-damaged buildings as the fires continued to spread. Only 5 of 40 workers interviewed recalled ever participating in a fire drill. Many reported never receiving training on how to exit the building in an emergency. The report also examined the role of external oversight. Property insurers had conducted an audit of the Port Wentworth facility in May 2007. A trade association to which Imperial belonged had also audited the plant. Neither audit flagged the combustible dust accumulations as a significant hazard. The trade association gave Imperial a supreme rating based on cleanliness and food product quality, factors entirely unrelated to explosion or fire safety. Both organizations possessed training materials addressing combustible dust hazards. Their inspectors knew these hazards existed. The information was not passed along to Imperial Sugar and was not applied during the audits. CSB Chairman John Breslin summarized the findings. Dust explosions can be among the deadliest of industrial hazards, particularly inside heavily occupied buildings. But these explosions are readily prevented through appropriate equipment design and maintenance and rigorous dust cleaning programs. Imperial Sugar rebuilt its Port Wentworth refinery on an accelerated timeline. Bulk sugar shipping resumed in July 2009. The blast-damaged sections of the facility reopened in November of that year. The company promoted the reconstructed plant as the most modern and efficient sugar refinery in the country, featuring state-of-the-art technologies and comprehensive safety systems. The reopening provided relief to workers who had spent nearly 2 years wondering whether their jobs would return. Former Port Wentworth Mayor Glenn Jones recalled the anxiety that had pervaded the community. A lot of those guys were in their 40s and 50s, and you just don't find another job at that age if that's where you've been your whole life. People were worried. When the CEO announced the commitment to rebuilding, it represented a sigh of relief for families who had built generations around employment at the Dixie Crystals refinery. Port Wentworth itself had suffered economic depression during the closure. Local businesses that depended on refinery workers as customers saw revenues decline sharply. The tiny community of approximately 3,500 residents had organized much of its civic life around the plant that had defined its identity since 1917. Civil litigation followed the regulatory proceedings. 44 lawsuits for damages stemming from the explosion were filed in Chatham County State Court. Judge Herman Coolidge ruled in August 2010 that sufficient factual issues existed for juries to determine damage claims in several cases. However, none of the lawsuits ever proceeded to jury trial. The cases were resolved through settlements that provided compensation to victims and their families. The corporate ownership of the refinery would change hands multiple times in the years following the disaster. In May 2012, Louis Dreyfus Commodities, a Netherlands-based agribusiness giant, announced acquisition of all outstanding Imperial Sugar stock for $6.35 per share, assuming $125 million in Imperial debt. The price represented a 57% premium over Imperial's trading price. A decade later, in November 2022, Louis Dreyfus sold Imperial Sugar to United States Sugar Corporation, a Florida-based refiner. The Department of Justice challenged this merger as anti-competitive, arguing it would leave an overwhelming majority of refined sugar sales across the Southeast in the hands of only 2 producers. The legal battle eventually resolved in favor of the merger, and the Port Wentworth refinery passed to its current ownership more than a century after Benjamin Oxnard first envisioned a sugar plant on the Savannah River. The 14 deaths at Port Wentworth should have catalyzed fundamental changes in how American industry manages combustible dust hazards. The Chemical Safety Board had been recommending a comprehensive federal dust standard since its 2006 report. The Imperial Sugar explosion provided tragic validation of these recommendations. OSHA announced shortly after the disaster that it intended to initiate rulemaking toward a comprehensive combustible dust standard. The regulatory process proved agonizingly slow. OSHA submitted an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in September 2009. The notice covered data collection, hazard assessment, and discussion of different regulatory approaches. The rule would potentially cover metal, wood, plastic, rubber, coal, flour, sugar, and paper industries. But the rulemaking stalled. Industry observers identified multiple impediments: the large potential cost of implementation, an anti-regulatory political climate, and an increasingly drawn-out federal rulemaking process. By 2013, the Chemical Safety Board took the rare step of publicly rebuking OSHA for failing to implement national safety standards on combustible dust. citing the Imperial sugar explosion and more than 200 other fires and explosions that had occurred across the country. Even Imperial Sugar's CEO John Schefter joined the criticism. His company had taken the dust control message to heart, implementing comprehensive safety systems in the rebuilt Port Wentworth facility. "Where I am most displeased," Schefter stated, "is that we still do not have a standard from Washington." The absence of federal requirements meant that other facilities across American industry continued operating with conditions similar to those that had destroyed the original Port Wentworth plant. The proposed combustible dust rule was eventually moved to OSHA's list of long-term actions, regulatory purgatory from which rules rarely emerge. In July 2017, the Trump administration formally killed the proposed rule, citing resource constraints and other OSHA priorities. The 14 workers who died at Port Wentworth had not managed to change federal policy. Dust explosions continued claiming lives. The statistical pattern identified by the CSB in 2006 of consistent annual deaths from combustible dust across American industry persisted through the following decades. The corporate structure of Imperial Sugar in the years preceding the disaster reflected the complexities of modern industrial ownership. The company had grown through acquisition, absorbing Savannah Foods and its subsidiaries, Holly Sugar, Spreckles Sugar. Each acquisition brought not only physical plants, but also distinct organizational cultures, safety practices, and operational procedures. The bankruptcy filing in 2001 and subsequent reorganization had stripped away peripheral operations, focusing the company on its core sugar refining business. But the financial pressures of bankruptcy, the need to service debt while maintaining competitive positions in price-sensitive markets, created incentives that did not necessarily align with comprehensive safety investment. Maintenance deferred, upgrades postponed. Equipment ran beyond optimal replacement cycles. Imperial Sugar hired a new chief operating officer in February 2007. This executive was promoted to chief executive officer on January 29, 2008, just 9 days before the Port Wentworth explosion. In November 2007, the vice president of operations Graham H. Graham visited the facility and documented his concerns in an email to CEO John Schefter. Graham classified the problems he observed into 4 categories: environment, people and management, process and machinery, and systems and procedures. This was not a vague expression of unease. It was a systematic categorization of operational deficiencies at a facility that would explode 3 months later. The email's existence demonstrated that corporate leadership possessed information about conditions at Port Wentworth. What response this information generated remains unclear from the investigation record. The explosion occurred before whatever actions might have been planned could be implemented. The workers who operated the Port Wentworth facility came from the communities surrounding Savannah, many of them carrying on family traditions of employment at the Dixie Crystals refinery. The Seminoe family, among the first to relocate from Louisiana in 1917, had members working at the plant across multiple generations. This was not unusual. In industrial towns built around single major employers, family employment patterns often span grandparents, parents, and children. These multi-generational connections created both strengths and vulnerabilities. Workers who saw their fathers and grandfathers operate safely in the refinery naturally absorbed the assumption that the workplace was safe. Conditions that objectively represented hazards had been present for as long as anyone could remember. The normalization of risk across generations was even more powerful than individual normalization over a single career. When families send their children to work in facilities where parents worked safely for decades, they are implicitly endorsing the safety of those facilities. The 14 workers who died included individuals whose families had trusted the refinery for generations. That trust was betrayed not by any single decision, but by the accumulated weight of deferred maintenance, ignored warnings, and organizational blindness that had built up over decades without producing catastrophe until it did. The aftermath rippled through these interconnected families in ways that statistics cannot capture. Workers who survived faced not only their own trauma, but the shared grief of a community where everyone knew someone who had died or been injured. The church across the street from the refinery, where families gathered seeking information about missing relatives, served a congregation drawn largely from refinery workers. Survivors of severe burns face recovery journeys measured in years rather than months. Skin grafts require multiple surgeries. Physical therapy to restore mobility is prolonged and painful. Psychological trauma from surviving an explosion that killed co-workers and friends compounds the physical challenges. Some survivors would never work again. Others returned to jobs that reminded them daily of what had happened. The families of the deceased faced different but equally devastating challenges. Workers who died had been primary breadwinners for households that suddenly lost income. Children lost parents. Spouses lost partners. Parents outlived children. The civil lawsuit settlements provided financial compensation, but no amount of money replaces a person who will never come home. When water contacts burning sugar, several reactions occur simultaneously. The sugar dissolves, creating a syrup that can remain superheated even as it flows. Water converts to steam at the sugar's surface temperature, a violent phase change that can propel material or create pressure surges. The cooling effect of water application can cause thermal shock in concrete structures that have been heated to extreme temperatures. Firefighters at Port Wentworth confronted these challenges without specialized training or equipment for sugar fires. The water they pumped onto the burning silos largely converted to steam before penetrating the combustion zone. When the silos were finally cool enough to approach, investigators found nearly 3 million pounds of fire-hardened sugar remaining in the structures. This material had been heated to temperatures that altered its crystalline structure, creating a caramelized mass quite different from the granulated product that had entered the silos. The comparison between the Port Wentworth disaster and other combustible dust explosions reveals patterns that extend across industries, decades, and continents. The West Pharmaceutical Services explosion in North Carolina in 2003 involved rubber dust. The CTA Acoustics explosion in Kentucky the same year involved phenolic resin dust. The Hayes-Lemmers explosion in Indiana involved aluminum dust. Each disaster resulted from different materials processed in different facilities by different companies. Each disaster followed the same fundamental pattern: dust accumulation, ignition source, catastrophic deflagration. International experience reinforced these warnings. Sugar dust explosions had been documented in Germany, France, and other nations with significant sugar refining industries. The physics of combustible dust operate identically regardless of national boundaries. Despite this global pattern of incidents and the clear scientific understanding of dust explosion hazards, the American regulatory framework remained inadequate to compel systematic prevention. The CSB had recommended such a standard in 2006. The recommendation remained unimplemented when the explosion occurred. It remained unimplemented when the CSB issued its final report in 2009. It remained unimplemented when the CSB publicly rebuked OSHA in 2013. It remained unimplemented when the rule was formally killed in 2017. 20 years of recommendations produced 0 pages of binding federal standards. The economic calculations underlying industrial safety decisions reveal tensions that persist across industries and eras. Comprehensive dust control requires investment in equipment, maintenance, and personnel. Explosion venting requires structural modifications. Worker training requires time away from production. Each of these expenditures reduces profit margins in price-sensitive commodity markets where pennies per pound determine competitive position. Companies operating under financial stress face particularly acute pressure to defer discretionary spending. Safety investments that do not address immediate regulatory requirements can be postponed indefinitely. The benefits of prevention are statistical and future-oriented. The costs of prevention are immediate and concrete. The $6 million settlement that Imperial Sugar ultimately paid to OSHA represented a small fraction of the total costs imposed by the disaster. The $15 million loss in the first quarter of 2008 alone exceeded that penalty. The cost of rebuilding the destroyed facilities, the litigation settlements, the reputational damage, and the regulatory oversight requirements imposed far greater financial burdens. But these costs were imposed after the disaster occurred. No pre-disaster calculation could have incorporated these consequences. The question of what would have been required to prevent the Port Wentworth disaster admits straightforward answers. Comprehensive dust housekeeping programs that removed accumulated material before it reached hazardous levels. Ventilation systems adequate to capture dust at generation points before it dispersed into work areas. Explosion venting on enclosed conveyors and bucket elevators to safely release pressure if ignition occurred. Management of change procedures that evaluated the hazard implications of modifications like the conveyor enclosure installed in 2007. Worker training on dust hazards and emergency evacuation procedures. None of these requirements demanded technological innovation. All were standard practices in industries that took combustible dust hazards seriously. The barrier to implementation was not capability, but priority. This failure of priority cannot be attributed to any single individual. It pervaded the organization at all levels. Management failed to establish clear requirements and enforce compliance. Supervision failed to escalate concerns when conditions deteriorated. Workers failed to demand improvement in conditions they recognized as hazardous. External auditors failed to identify obvious problems. Regulators failed to inspect and enforce. Legislators failed to mandate adequate standards. The disaster emerged from systemic failure distributed across multiple actors, none of whom individually bore complete responsibility. But collectively, their failures produced 14 deaths that every investigation concluded were entirely preventable. George Simoneau, whose family was among the first to relocate from Louisiana when the plant opened, was born at the refinery 3 years after it began operations. He worked there for 31 years. His wife worked at the hotel on the property. His niece worked there too. When the explosion destroyed the packing buildings, Simoneau described it as losing a member of the family. The images of devastation, of buckled concrete and burned structures, were hard for him to look at. His niece compared it to the September 11th attacks, the incomprehensibility of sudden destruction visited upon a familiar place. In communities built around single large employers, the workplace becomes woven into identity across generations. Families send sons and daughters to work beside parents and grandparents. Social networks form around shift schedules. Churches fill with congregations drawn from the same employee roster. When the workplace fails catastrophically, the trauma extends beyond those directly injured to encompass everyone whose sense of place and security depended on the continued operation of the facility they had trusted. The physical legacy of the 2008 explosion has largely disappeared. The damaged buildings were demolished. The burned silos were brought down. Modern construction replaced the antiquated structures. A visitor to the Port Wentworth refinery today would find a facility designed with contemporary safety standards, featuring explosion venting, dust collection systems, and emergency procedures that reflect the lessons learned from the disaster. But certain things cannot be rebuilt. The 14 workers who died are permanently absent from the community that knew them. The survivors who suffered severe burns carry physical and psychological scars that no reconstruction can address. The families who lost breadwinners, spouses, parents, and children continue living with absences that no settlement payment can fill. The regulatory legacy proved equally mixed. Federal combustible dust standards that the CSB recommended and that the Port Wentworth disaster should have catalyzed never materialized. OSHA's National Emphasis Program on Combustible Dust remains in place, directing inspectors to examine facilities for dust hazards, but this falls short of the comprehensive mandatory standard that safety advocates sought. Companies are left to self-regulate their dust control programs, relying on industry guidance and insurance requirements rather than federal enforcement. Every year, dust explosions continue killing American workers. The CSB's 2006 finding of 281 incidents over 25 years did not represent a historical anomaly. It represented a baseline rate of industrial failure that has persisted largely unchanged despite high-profile disasters. The sugar industry appears to have internalized the lessons of Port Wentworth. Imperial Sugar's rebuilt facility incorporates safety features that address the specific vulnerabilities exposed by the explosion. Other sugar refiners have implemented similar improvements. Within this narrow sector, the 14 deaths achieved preventive value for workers who now operate in facilities designed to avoid the conditions that proved fatal. Whether this progress represents adequate response to the disaster depends on one's expectations of what industrial catastrophe should accomplish. If the standard is learning from specific failure to prevent its recurrence, the sugar industry has largely met that standard. If the standard is transforming specific failure into systemic reform that protects workers across all industries facing similar hazards, the Port Wentworth explosion failed to achieve its potential. 14 workers walked into the Imperial Sugar Refinery on February 7, 2008, expecting to complete their shifts and return home to families who expected them. Their names are recorded now in investigation reports, memorial services, lawsuit filings, and the memories of those who knew them. They did not die because sugar exploded. They died because the organization responsible for their safety allowed explosive conditions to develop over years, ignored warnings that those conditions were dangerous, failed to implement basic dust control measures that were well understood by industrial safety professionals, and made a modification to equipment that dramatically increased the hazard without evaluating the consequences. Every death was preceded by opportunities to intervene. Every intervention would have required only the application of existing knowledge and the commitment of modest resources. The barriers between those workers and survival were not technological. They were cultural and institutional. The conveyor belt runs beneath the silos, carrying granulated sugar from storage to packaging just as conveyors have run at this location for more than a century. The dust that every process generates is now captured, contained, removed by systems designed to prevent accumulation. The bearings that drive the belts are monitored, maintained, replaced before they overheat. The lessons of 2008 are embedded in the hardware and procedures of daily operation. But hardware ages, procedures fade, organizations forget. The pressure to produce, to cut costs, to meet schedules, to compete in markets that do not price safety remains constant. The question is not whether the rebuilt refinery has learned from disaster. The question is whether the learning will persist across decades, across ownership changes, across turnover of workers and managers who never experienced the consequences of forgetting. 14 workers answered that question with their lives. The answer they provided was that forgetting costs everything. Whether future generations remember their testimony depends on choices that are being made now, in facilities across American industry, by workers and managers who have never seen sugar burn for 7 days.